Hi everyone, this is Mike. In this video we're going to take a little bit of a walkthrough of the BizTalk plus Castle Windsor example. In the BizTalk console here I've got an application called acme.mybiztalk.app, MyBizTalk app. It's a really straightforward app where we have an orchestration called claims validation process. We have a receive location that's going to pick a message up from a file. The message is going to go through that orchestration and it's going to go out to the send port, which is going to write it back to disk. And if we have a quick look at this in action, so we copy our file to disk and rename it to an XML file, and then that'll get picked up, and you can see it's now in the output folder. Very simple, and all it's basically done is it's got a claim ID, which is just this string, and then it's got a value, which is the isTrue value. So in this case it was true. If we have a quick look at the input, you can see the input simply had the claim ID. Now if we jump into the code base, in the application here we've got this claims validation process orchestration, and if we take a little bit of a look at this, we can see it's pretty simple, where we've got a receive, we call out to the validate function, and you can see here I've got a helper C# component called claims validation process helper. There's an isValid method, and I simply pass in my request object to that, which is based on my BizTalk message. So I've just created a .NET type from the schema, and I can pass that straight in and let BizTalk do its usual serialization stuff. I get back my isValid boolean value, and then in the assign message, again I call into the same helper class, and I've got a method called build response, and I pass in my claim request message and my isValid property, and that method's going to then create my response message, which gets returned. Now at this point I haven't done anything with Castle. This is pretty vanilla stuff, but what I'm now going to look at is under the hood we're going to sort of go in and see how we can start breaking dependencies between these different sort of things. Now in my helpers assembly I've got an orchestrations folder which has this one class that sort of acts as a facade to the .NET world. So I usually have one class per orchestration to just act as like a helper for each one. Now in here, normally what you'd probably see would be a whole bunch of logic in this method doing loads of different stuff, and likewise down here. But instead what I've done is I've got my app container, which is a class that's that I'll go into in more detail in a minute. But if you imagine every BizTalk application I write, I'll have a container which will get loaded up with some resolutions of interface to concrete class. So what I can say here is that I want to get something that'll validate my claim, which will implement the iClaim validator, and then the container will give me back that object, and I'll just execute the isValid method on it, and then I'll return that. And likewise on the response builder, I'll ask for an object that implements iClaim response builder, and I'll execute the build method on that. Now what that means is that I can kind of put those classes can be kind of anywhere. They could be in this solution, they could be in another DLL that I drop in, they could be a framework DLL. I've kind of taken away that concrete dependency between them. And for the simple example, it may be slight overkill doing that, but if you go into more complex solutions, kind of breaking these things out can have a lot of benefits for the simplicity of your code. So we mentioned before that in the types folder, the type I'm passing in here, iClaim request, I'll just show that before we get into too much more detail. So that gets generated in here as a .NET type based on some MS build I've got in the override build.target, which will just run xsd.exe and generate some classes from that schema. Now what happens then, if you imagine here, I'm going to request my app container, and this is going to call down into my utilities project down here, where I've got my app container class, and this again, this is part of my application. And in here, all I've done is kind of put a wrapper around some framework code I've written, which will be reusable across BizTalk solutions. So the first thing I want to do is I want to create a singleton instance so that each application can load its own container once and kind of manage different orchestrations would access the same container and could resolve instances from it. And it also means that I can have some config and stuff like that specific to this app. So in my app container, I've defined my application name as acme.biztalkapp, and I've created a singleton instance of this class from my framework called BizTalk application container. And what I'm going to do is, if it's already created, I'll just return it, but if not, then I'll create a lock and I'll load up the container. And then elsewhere on here, I've just put some helper methods that make it a little bit easier, so I'm writing a little bit less code each time I want to access the container. But all these do is they actually just pass on the call into the framework anyway, but it's just a little bit less code to write every time you use it. And that kind of comes back to where up here I go app container.get, and you know, it's very straightforward. Now my app container, the first time I access this, it obviously loads up my BizTalk application class, and that calls down into my framework this appfx.biztalk.utilities, which has this IOC folder. And my BizTalk application, you can see inherits from a class called application container, which is something I've used in the non-BizTalk world as well as a generic wrapper for Castle Windsor. But in this case, I've created a BizTalk version of it because I add a little bit of extra logic on top of that non-BizTalk version. So the first thing is we've got the application name, and then after that we load the container. And you can see here I call into my container config, which will give me back some info from the config system, and you'll see the code for that's inside the config namespace. And we can see an example from the BizTalk config file of what that would look like. So in here I've got a custom config section, and the sort of implementation of that section gives me a bunch of containers, and I've requested one that matches my application name, and I tell you what the loader type would be. So there's a couple of different ways you can load that. In this case I've chosen BRE, which means I'm going to load it from the BizTalk rules engine, and the loader key for BRE would be the name of what the BizTalk rules policy would be. You can see I've also got a loader type of none, which means I'll just get an empty container, and a developer would be able to register any types at runtime that they wanted to on their own. And I guess in the loaders, so the loader folder contains the implementation of each individual one. And you can see we've got a BRE loader, a config loader, which I'm currently working on, and a custom type container loader, but they all implement this container loader interface. And in the BizTalk application container, you can see down here, once we get the config, we sort of get the loader, and if it's BRE, it'll return that class. Config's going to be something that I'll just look up from another config section. Custom lets you define your own loader class, so that'll call into here, and you would specify a strong name for a class that you want to like defer that call onto, so you could write your own implementation somewhere else in your code and manage the whole thing yourself. But I think for most people the BRE one will be quite a cool one, and the reason I believe that is firstly, if we have a look in the rules policy, so I've defined my my BizTalk container policy, and I have a rule that says if true equals true, which means it'll execute every time. And then I simply have this container contents object, which has an add assembly method on it, and basically all I'm doing is adding the name of any assemblies that I want to have the container will scan them. And I can just add, can add another one here by just dragging it in again, and I can have as many of those as I like, just defining each assembly I want to scan. Now I guess what's quite cool about BRE is I suppose if I really wanted to, I could put some more complex logic in here, so I load up the container with different assemblies each time. You know, that would be getting quite fancy with it, but if you keep it simple and just load up the assemblies you want, I guess that'll cover like many scenarios. So after that, we've got our loader, which is going to call into, so in this case we'll say the BRE loader, and you can see here that inside the loader I'm going to create a container contents object, and I've got the policy name, so I'm going to pass that in, execute the BizTalk rules policy to get that list of assemblies, and then I'm going to execute this install from assemblies method, and that's an extension method I've got for Castle, where it's basically going to go through each assembly and look for any classes that implement Windsor installer, this Windsor installer interface, and then it'll call out to those installers. So if you imagine this C# project doesn't have a reference to any of your application code, but at runtime you've told it a list of assemblies to go and inspect to look for installer classes, and in this case my helper assembly up here has a default installer in it, where I can just specify I want to register with my container this claim validator, and I want it to be implemented by the simple claim validator class. So in my business logic here, you can see I've implemented my iClaim validator interface, which is dead straightforward, and my simple claim validator class, which has this one method that just has a really straightforward implementation of it. But all I've done is, rather than having my orchestrations helper class have to sort of make a concrete instantiation of that simple claim validator, I've sort of broken those apart, and I've said, look, you know, the helper class doesn't know anything about simple claim validator, it just knows the container. I'll give it a claim validator it'll be provided by from somewhere else. And at runtime in BizTalk, because I've used the rules engine, I can install this container and I've got all the objects that I want in there. But if I was unit testing my helper class on its own, you know, I was focusing on just this one class here, what I might do instead would be to load the container with a mock object. So I might create a mock of this iClaim validator interface and a mock of this claim response builder, and then I can unit test my claim validator process helper without having to have any concrete classes involved at all. And that's one of the benefits from a testability perspective, where breaking apart these classes means we can inject mock types instead. So I guess if we go back up into the orchestration now and just have a look again at the code inside the expression here, you can see there's no real use of Castle at this level. Now what I have done is, in the container I have put some in the application container I have put some stuff on here where it, you know, normally in .NET I've been using generics with this, but I've put a couple of methods on here where it's just pass in the type you want, it'll give you back an object, and you could do a cast. So I guess I could also use that approach up here to get objects from the container if I wanted to, but to be honest my preference has always been having this single helper class to act as a bridge between the orchestration logic and the .NET world underneath. And I think my preference is to still continue that approach and just use all of the container stuff inside that helper class. I think it just keeps it easier that way, and you know, you get all the benefits of it, of the C# code and being a bit nicer rather than having to code lots of stuff in the expression shapes. I guess that's kind of a high-level overview. I mean, what we could do is, I guess we can run through some of this code and just give a quick example of it running. So if I attach to the process, so if we create the input document, we change the extension for that. And if we can hit the breakpoint here in the helper class, and if we see we step into that, and then if we go to request the object, it'll create the container, and you can see because it's not created yet, it'll call into the BizTalk application container in our framework. And you can see here as we step in, we'll create the underlying container with the non-BizTalk specific stuff that we inherit from, and then we pass in and we call the load container method. So this now steps through, and we're going to pull back information from the config. So you can see here we call out to the config file. So we can get the loader type, the loader key. You can see we've got BRE and the policy name, and then we'll get our config loader and we'll call into that. We pass in our Windsor container. So you can see here we're now in the helper, the sort of BRE loader class, sorry, and you can see we've created this container contents object which currently has nothing in it, and we call the BRE policy. So we've executed that from .NET, and you can see now this contains one assembly, and it's told us which one to run. So what I'm going to do for a second is I'm going to jump up and put a breakpoint in here, because this, when the framework now executes the next line, it's going to sort of cascade this install from assemblies up to the assemblies that we've provided from BRE. So you can see here it's now jumped up to my other assembly, and it's executing this install method, and that's going to actually register my classes that I want to be returned with those interfaces in the container. So we now come out of the load method, and we've loaded our container. It's all good. We've got our container reference back, and you can see when we now go to resolve the type, you can see when we've requested for an iClaim validator, we've been given back the claims processor.simple claim validator, even though we don't have a direct reference to that. So I can now call into the isValid method, and that'll let me jump into the simple claims validator class where I can execute that logic. So you can see with the framework in place, it was really easy to just kind of wrap it with my app container class that I have at my application level, just to make it easier to use, and it wraps the singleton around it. But actually all I'm really doing is offloading everything to the framework, which is contains the container and all the loading and stuff like that. And so hopefully that gives you a really good approach where you can start getting some of the benefits of inversion of control, dependency injection and stuff like that into your BizTalk solutions, which I think a lot of people haven't really thought about putting those two together before.